Welcome back to Deep Dive, the podcast where we watch powerful nations shake hands, accomplish nothing, and call it diplomacy. I'm your host, and today we're diving into something so consistently pointless, I genuinely respect its dedication to failure: U.S.-China diplomatic summits. Two of the most powerful nations on Earth with enough combined wealth to gold plate Mars, sitting across an expensive table, eating expensive food, smiling for cameras, and resolving absolutely nothing. Buckle up, here's the setup for those who've been sensibly ignoring the news. Every few years, the U.S. president and Xi Jinping meet somewhere photogenic. They shake hands. Photographers hyperventilate. Press releases describe candid and constructive dialogue, which is diplomats speak for "we argued constantly, but nobody threw anything." But while the political theater is incredibly loud, especially going into this latest meeting the press is calling the Beans and Boeing Summit, complete with the U.S. slapping up to 145% tariffs and China retaliating with its own tariffs and rare earth mineral restrictions, the real driving force behind these tensions is completely silent. It's not driven by political posturing, it's driven by cold, hard math. Today we're looking past the photo ops to explore the unbending accounting that actually dictates the global economy.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the diplomatic theater, then dig into the real problem, accounting. From there, we'll explain financial repression, look at Europe's manufacturing crisis, explore America's deficit trap, and finally ask, are we headed for cooperation or catastrophe? Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The diplomatic theater and the incredibly modest expectations surrounding these summits. Because to understand the room, you really have to understand the immense pressures both leaders are facing back home before they even sit down at that expensive table. Now, what's fascinating here is how the evening news completely shatters reality by focusing entirely on the political view. You know the stuff: personalities, tariffs, who is winning the handshake. Both leaders arrive under massive domestic stress. China is dealing with a falling property sector, youth unemployment, and demographic decline. Meanwhile, the U.S. is battling inflationary consequences, a 34% presidential approval rating, and military entanglements in the Middle East. It looks like a classic political showdown, right? But the actual roadblock, the thing nobody wants to talk about, it's the accounting view. We're talking balance of payments, national savings rates, structural surpluses. Politicians completely failed to fix this because, well, they simply don't address the underlying math.
Which brings us to Section 2, the real problem, accounting. To really grasp this, we've got to go back to the absolute fundamental purpose of trade, a concept as old as the economist David Ricardo. At its core, trade is fundamentally about exchange.
Think about it. The entire purpose of selling goods abroad is to acquire foreign currency so you can buy foreign goods that you actually need. But there's this great quote from Financial Times journalist Robin Harding. He traveled to China, asked what the country actually wants to buy from the rest of the world, and the answer was, essentially, nothing. There is nothing China believes it cannot make better and cheaper domestically, and nothing for which it wants to rely on foreigners. Back in the early 2000s, sure, China exported a lot, but they also imported heavy equipment. Today, their imports are comparatively anemic. And here's the thing: if a country only wants to sell and never wants to buy, they aren't actually trading. They're just collecting pieces of paper. It's kind of like a giant puzzle, but let's use a simpler analogy. Imagine a town baker. This baker aggressively prices the butcher, the brewer, and the candle maker into bankruptcy. Fast forward a few years, the baker looks around and wonders why nobody in town can afford to buy bread. It's wild, right? If your goal is to systematically put the rest of the world's manufacturing out of business, you eventually slam into a massive mathematical wall. Your customers simply run out of money. The math eventually breaks down for everyone.
Section 3. Financial repression explained. So, if this strategy eventually makes everyone poorer, why do countries do it? For that, we need to look at the work of Michael Pettis, a brilliant finance professor at Peking University. Here is the absolutely crucial point. Massive trade surpluses, they aren't just trade policy. They are the automatic consequence of domestic choices. It's called financial repression. Basically, when a government suppresses household income, whether that's through weak labor protections, an undervalued currency, or keeping interest rates on savings artificially low, it effectively transfers wealth from ordinary, everyday citizens to the state and to manufacturers. This forces the national savings rate up. The households simply earn less than they produce, meaning they physically cannot consume enough to absorb everything their own economy makes. Let's break down exactly how this builds. It happens in 3 steps. First, you subsidize production over consumption, so all that excess saving gets dumped into investment. And hey, at first, building infrastructure creates real, tangible growth. But eventually you reach step 2, you overbuild. Once you have enough high-speed rail lines and apartment blocks, building more actually destroys economic value. The projects cost more than they generate, and it just shows up as dead debt. So, since your citizens can't afford to buy the goods and your domestic infrastructure is totally maxed out, you hit step 3. That excess output absolutely has to go somewhere. It goes abroad as a trade surplus. It's not some evil master plan. The accounting literally leaves no other option.
Moving on to Section 4, Europe's manufacturing crisis. If China is producing vastly more than it can consume, who on earth is absorbing all this excess? Well, let's look at the first massive spillover, the European Union.
Just look at the sheer scale of this. Europe is currently running a trade deficit with China of roughly 1 billion euros per day. Yes, you heard that right, per day. That is a staggering number, driven by an absolute flood of manufactured goods, particularly electric vehicles and electronics. Europe is essentially drowning in this excess global production, and it's causing sheer panic for their domestic industries.
But here is the profound irony of the whole situation. While Europe is being flooded with cheap goods, they are simultaneously strangling their own competitiveness. Get this, German firms alone recently had to hire 325,000 people over 3 years, literally just to tick regulatory boxes. The IMF estimates that simply selling goods across EU borders costs firms the equivalent of a 44% tariff on goods and a massive 110% tariff on services. These aren't foreign tariffs, folks. They are self-imposed regulatory tariffs. The EU is essentially fighting a trade war against its own economy, making them uniquely vulnerable to this external flood of excess production.
Hey, quick break. If you're enjoying this, subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and recruit one friend who ruins dinner parties with trade policy opinions. You know exactly who that is. They desperately need this podcast. Reviews keep this show alive. Given the state of US-China relations, I need something in my life that's actually functioning. Don't let handshakes and headaches become another failed summit. Hit the button. Unlike the WTO, I'll actually notice. Okay, let's get back to it. Section 5, America's deficit trap. While Europe absorbs a lot, they aren't the final stop. That leaves the United States, the ultimate consumer of last resort.
You see, the US has the deepest, most liquid financial markets in the entire world. So when countries generate excess savings, about half of it ends up right here in American financial markets. And here is the unbending mathematical rule. When foreign capital flows into the US to buy bonds and financial assets, the US must, by definition, run a corresponding trade deficit. This is what economists call a balance of payments identity. It is not an American choice. The surplus countries mathematically force the US to run a deficit.
Because American corporations are already sitting on piles of cash and really don't need this foreign capital for new factories, the US economy has to absorb it in one of 3 pretty grim ways. Option 1, push up unemployment as cheap imports kill domestic factories. Option 2, push up household debt as consumers borrow to spend. Or option 3, push up the fiscal deficit as the government borrows. Since politicians will literally do anything to avoid option 1, nobody wants higher unemployment on their watch, America historically relies on heavily pushing up debt and government deficits.
And this creates a deeply, deeply destructive feedback loop. First, the government runs a deficit and issues treasury bonds. This attracts more foreign surplus savings. That influx of capital then strengthens the US dollar. And a stronger dollar? Well, it makes American exports totally uncompetitive, which just widens the trade deficit even further. To fund this whole operation, the U.S. Treasury has been using short-term borrowing to fund long-term obligations, essentially betting that long-term interest rates will drop. It's an incredibly aggressive gamble, especially while the government is simultaneously running tariffs and policies that engineer inflation.
Section 6, Cooperation or Catastrophe. If all of this feels unsustainable, well, that's because it is, and history proves it. Let's step back and look at the historical cycle of global imbalances.
Financial Times commentator Martin Wolf points out that these massive clashes over trade imbalances, they occur roughly every 2 decades. In the 1920s, it ended in global depression and war. In the 1980s, the major economies cooperated and resolved it through the Plaza Accord. In 2008, it ended in a massive global financial crisis. So historically speaking, these accounting imbalances end in only one of 2 ways: coordinated international adjustment or absolute economic catastrophe. There's really no middle ground.
And the crazy part is, economists saw this coming almost a century ago. Back at the Bretton Woods Conference in the 1940s, John Maynard Keynes proposed something called Bancor, a neutral international currency designed specifically to penalize both persistent deficits and persistent surpluses. But the U.S. firmly rejected it. Why? Because back then, the U.S. was the world's dominant manufacturer. They were the surplus nation. By refusing a balance system back then, the U.S. essentially consolidated the dollar as the global reserve currency, trapping itself in the very deficits it complains about today.
Which brings us right back to the diplomatic handshakes happening right now. The U.S. president arrives at the negotiating table largely disarmed by his own courts. The Supreme Court struck down his APA tariffs, and a federal trade court ruled his Section 122 tariffs illegal. With their main tools stripped away, both sides are really just using the summit to buy time. The U.S. wants time to build rare earth processing capacity, and China wants time to develop its semiconductor industry independently.
So what's the point of these summits if they solve nothing, honestly? Maybe preventing things from getting worse? A tense non-war is preferable to an actual war, marginally, probably. But the real function is theater. Both leaders return home having demonstrated they engaged firmly, stood their ground, and definitely didn't blink. Markets calm briefly, headlines shift. And so they'll announce new committees, take very serious-looking photos, and fly home. The underlying problem remains completely untouched, gathering dust next to every previous joint communique nobody read. Diplomatic summits aren't about solving problems. They're about performing the act of trying to solve problems. It's expensive, multilingual, beautifully catered kabuki. Because until China makes the difficult political choice to boost its own citizens' consumption and the U.S. stops blindly absorbing the world's surplus capital, the math will not change. Trade imbalances aren't caused by a lack of summits. They are caused by deeply entrenched domestic policy choices. Which leaves us with the ultimate question. As the accounting continues to do what accounting relentlessly does and the pressure builds, will the next global adjustment be driven by an era of unprecedented cooperation, or are we marching toward inevitable catastrophe? Something has to give. Before we wrap up, a final, massive credit to my brilliant producer FireflyHaku, whose editorial skill turns my unhinged ranting into a coherent podcast. FireflyHaku has achieved more structural alignment in this audio file than the US and China have managed in 3 decades of summitry. Respect where it's due. Thanks for listening, Yada Nation. See you next episode.